Welcome to Dieu Han RV, where silence holds pain, and every story hides a wound too deep to name. She was abandoned as a child, now a mother, too young, too alone, still crawling through life for her son. If you feel that weight in your chest, subscribe, like, or share this video. Not everyone gets rescued, but everyone deserves to be seen. Let this be a place where no pain stays invisible. The blanket was warm, but then still shivered beneath it. His skin burned, drenched in feverish sweat. His eyelids fluttered, barely opening before pain forced them shut again. He had no idea how long he'd been out. Somewhere above, a fan whirred faintly. A cold towel rested on his forehead, placed by someone he didn't know. He wanted to say thank you, but his voice never made it past his throat. Then looked around the small, empty room. Just for blank walls, a bamboo mat beneath him, and silence. No furniture, no faces, only the weight of his body and the ache in his bones. He didn't know who brought him here, but the fact he wasn't lying in the street meant something. He closed his eyes again. Not to sleep, but to gather strength from the quiet. Thoughts swirled inside Than's head like a storm with no direction. Faces, voices, memories, blurring, fading, returning. He wasn't sure what was real anymore. The fever had messed with his mind. But beneath the fog, one name kept rising. Dieu Han. He whispered it once under his breath, like a prayer, then forced himself to breathe slow and out. This wasn't the time to panic, not yet. Than shifted slightly, letting his back press against the cool wall. He needed something steady, anything, to anchor himself. The silence around him felt heavy, but not cruel, just indifferent. He counted his breaths again, this time slower. He imagined her voice, her quiet strength. Dieu Han wasn't just a name. She was why he came this far. He wasn't ready to let that go, not now, not ever. His stomach growled again, loud and hollow. But hunger wasn't the worst part. It was the not knowing where he was, who helped him, whether she was still out there, or if this whole journey had been a mistake. But then had tasted regret before, and this didn't feel like that. This felt like faith. The kind you hold onto even when nothing makes sense. The last thing Than remembered was dozing off in the front seat. He had pulled over, arms crossed, head pounding. Rain still tapped gently on the windshield. He closed his eyes just for a minute, too exhausted to care. That's when his phone lit up. A coworker was calling. He saw the name, hesitated, and then the world slipped away. The smell of damp fabric filled the car, then wiped sweat from his neck. He hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken to anyone in hours, but the call had anchored him. He wasn't drifting anymore. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, letting his body rest. Not because he gave up, but because now he could. But Hong's voice echoed in Than's chest. He pictured his friend on the road, checking maps, driving fast. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. That mattered. Than's hands relaxed, not clenched like before. For once, his body stopped bracing for the worst. He sat still, listening to the hum of the road outside. No sirens, no voices, just time passing. Somewhere out there, Hong was moving closer. Then didn't know how far, didn't care. A friend was coming. That was real, and in this moment, real was enough to hold onto. Than's head rested against the car seat, breath shallow. His eyelids grew heavy, the edges of the world softening. Somewhere in the haze, a figure appeared, barefoot in the mud, her hair tangled by the wind. Dieu Han. She didn't speak. She only smiled. And in that smile, there was no hunger, no fear, no past, just sunlight and warmth, the kind of peace he hadn't known in years. In the dream, she reached out her hand, then didn't hesitate. He took it. They were by the river, water glittering under morning light. Dieu Han laughed, not the quiet, ardent girl he once met, but free, joyful, as if nothing had ever broken her. He laughed too, not because life was perfect, but because it felt possible again. Even in a dream, that was enough. They walked together down an empty path. The grass brushed their ankles, the sky wide and clear. Then glanced sideways at her. She looked at peace. No shadows in her eyes. He wanted to stay there in this quiet place where no one heard, where silence meant comfort. not loss. He squeezed her hand once more, as if afraid the dream might vanish too soon. Then came the field, the golden and endless. Dieu Han ran through it barefoot, arms wide, then followed, laughing until his chest ached. They didn't say much, words weren't needed. It was enough to exist together, to be the people who had survived storms. And now stood where the wind only whispered. He closed his eyes again, deeper into the dream. But even in sleep, time doesn't stop. The field faded. Her laughter grew faint, then stirred in his seat, forehead damp. The dream tried to hold on, but the world was pulling him back. Still, one image lingered, her hand in his, not out of need, but out of choice. That memory, even imagined, stayed with him. Outside the dream, the world kept turning. A gentle knock tapped against the glass, once, twice, then didn't stir. He was still lost in that field of light, still holding a hand that only existed in memory, on the other side of the window. Hong leaned in, his face tense with worry. He knocked again, louder this time, but then, eyes closed, breath slow, was still walking with Dieu Han, somewhere far away. The dream shattered like glass, then blinked hard against the light pouring in. The car door creaked open. He moved on instinct, lifting a hand to shield his face. A figure stood outside. Buttoned shirt, glasses, a voice he knew but couldn't place. Then, "It's me." But the words didn't land. His vision blurred, body heavy. He wasn't sure if he was still dreaming, or if waking up just hurt this much. Hong opened the door wider, his eyes scanning Than's face. "You look terrible," he said softly, almost joking, but there was a tremble in his voice, then let out a weak chuckle. "I feel worse." They stared at each other for a second longer, until words weren't needed. Small nod, a breath, and in that moment, then realized someone still came when he called. Someone still remembered him, even when he barely remembered himself. Than's knees buckled without warning. The world tilted, spun. Hong caught him just in time, arms straining under the weight. "You're burning up," he muttered, then didn't respond. His head dropped against Hong's shoulder, breath shallow, skin cold. It wasn't just fever, it was exhaustion, the kind that settles in your bones when you've carried too much for too long. And Hong, for a moment, stood still, realizing this wasn't the friend he used to know. This was a man who'd been through a storm. How did it come to this? I remember him laughing, driving fast, chasing dreams like nothing could touch him. Now he's half conscious in my arms, and I don't even know where he's been. Was I too late? Should I have called sooner? Help more? Guilt pressed down, heavier than his weight. Whatever broke him, it didn't happen overnight, and I wasn't there. Not when he needed me, not when the cracks started showing, but I'm here now, and I'm not letting go. I should have noticed something the last time we talked. His voice was thinner, his jokes forced, but I let it go. I let him drift, because life got busy, and friendship felt optional. Now I see it was never optional. People like Then don't ask for help until they're drowning. And when they do, it's quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that screams. So if this is his call for help, I won't ignore it again. He isn't weak. Far from it. This man bore storms alone, without ever shouting for help. He held up more than anyone saw, and still chose to stand, even when his knees gave way. That kind of strength doesn't shine, it wears down quietly. And now, seeing him like this, not broken, but worn thin by the weight of everything, I don't pity him. I respect him more than ever. Then lay still in the back seat, his chest rising slow, eyes closed, like he'd escaped the world for a while. Hong glanced at the mirror, watching for any sign he might need to pull over. But then didn't stir, just the sound of rain and breath. Hong tightened his grip on the wheel. He wasn't just driving a friend home, he was carrying a story, a life that almost unraveled. And tonight, silence was heavier than words. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened with leftover sorrow. Hong pulled up in front of his place, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. He opened the back door, then hadn't moved. His face pale, breath uneven, like he was drifting between sleep and survival. Hong leaned in, arms slipping beneath his friend's shoulders. This wasn't just exhaustion. It was the weight of too many yesterdays, and Hong carried it like it was his own. Hong tightened his grip. Then wasn't heavy, but the burden felt enormous. 1 foot forward, then another. Each step a quiet promise that he wouldn't let his friend fall again. The weight pressed into his shoulders, but Hong said nothing. He didn't grunt. He didn't complain. Because there are moments when love speaks loudest through silence. Inside the house, Hong laid Then down gently, careful not to wake him. He wiped Than's forehead with a cool towel. The room was small, but it held a quiet peace. Hong didn't say much. He never needed to. Actions had always been his language. This was what loyalty looked like. A friend who doesn't vanish when things go wrong. A man who remembers. The storm outside had passed, but another storm still raged in Than's body. Hong sat beside the bed, watching his friend fight through waves of fever. He didn't know what had happened yet, why Than ended up like this, but he knew one thing: he would wait until Than woke up. Until he could say thank you. Until this man who once inspired him found his way again. Sometimes, life breaks us down in the quietest ways, not with tragedy, but with exhaustion. Not with loss, but with the feeling that no one cares. But that night, in Hong's humble home, something shifted. A seed of healing was planted, not just in Than's body, but in his heart. And in the heart of a friend who chose to stay, even when it wasn't his burden to carry. Than lay still, the fever not yet breaking. Beside him, Hong watched closely, eyes fixed on every subtle change, each shift in breath. Each quiet groan felt like a reminder of how fragile everything was. The room was silent except for the low hum of the fan and the slow rhythm of Than's breath. There was no rush, only waiting and hope. Than murmured something, barely a sound, but Hong leaned in quickly. It was just noise, incoherent and weak, but it stirred something in Hong. A strange mix of fear and tenderness washed over him. Then he knew was strong, tireless. Seeing him like this, pale and powerless, felt like seeing a different man entirely. The room stayed quiet except for the soft sound of breathing. Hong sat by the mat checking Than's temperature again. There was still heat on his forehead, but less than before. Every few hours, he'd help wipe the sweat, offer warm water, and adjust the blanket without waking Than. No one asked him to do this. He just stayed. Quietly. Sometimes caring didn't need words, only presence. The fever had broken. Than's body still felt heavy, but the weight was no longer unbearable. Hong had watched over him through the worst of it, never leaving his side. Even in the haze of sickness, Than could feel that care. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the soft light. For the first time in days, breath came easier. His heart, too, beat a little steadier. Healing had begun not just in his body, but deep within his spirit. Than lay there in silence, his gaze drifting across the ceiling. His body ached, but in a distant, dull way, like an echo fading out. He didn't speak, didn't move much, but his mind was slowly rejoining the present. He noticed the folded towel beside him, the cup of water that had been refilled, the faint scent of menthol lingering in the air. Someone had cared, and that changed everything. Hong sat at the edge of the bed, arms resting on his knees. He looked at Than, his voice quiet but steady. "What are you doing here, Than?" It wasn't an accusation, just concern. Than didn't answer right away. How could he explain the emptiness that led him here, the weight he'd carried alone? But in Hong's eyes, there was no judgment, just a friend, still willing to listen. Than looked down, fingers loosely gripping the blanket. "I'm here to find her, Dieu Han, and her son." The words came out slowly, like they had waited too long. "I don't know where to start, but I couldn't stay still anymore." Hong didn't interrupt. He just nodded, understanding more than words could say. Sometimes searching isn't about having a plan, it's about not letting the silence win. Hong stood silently at the top of the stairs, phone in hand, heart beating slightly faster than usual. He hadn't made a call like this in years. Not to chase work, not to look for someone, but Than had trusted him with a name, a face, a desperate hope. And that was enough. He dialed slowly, glancing down the hallway where Than was still resting. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of a ceiling fan above. then lay still, his body weak but his mind restless. Memories of the day before kept playing over and over again, looping like a film reel he couldn't pause. He remembered the moment he almost collapsed. The weight of the journey. The ache in his chest wasn't just from illness, it was from missing her. Dieu Han. Her name lived in every breath he took. Even breathing was a task, but then didn't complain. Not when he had something to hold on to. He stared at the ceiling, imagining the road that still lay ahead. Would it lead him to her? Would she even want to see him? Questions he couldn't answer. But giving up wasn't an option, not now. He had already lost too much. This wasn't just about finding Dieu Han anymore. It was about finding the part of himself he'd buried long ago. Will Thin ever find Han again, or is she already too far gone, lost to time, to fate, to silence? He doesn't know, but he's not giving up. Somewhere out there, in a world too wide and too loud, there's a quiet place where she still exists, and he's going to find it. No matter how long it takes, no matter how far he must go. Thank you for watching this story on Dieu Han RV. If it touched your heart even a little, please support us by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Every view, every click, every kind word helps this journey continue, not just on screen, but in real life too.
Người vẫn đứng nơi cuối con đường, vẫn chờ con chẳng hề rời xa.